guys, very excited to be here today to talk to Mark Boyle about the art of scenario planning. Now, before we get started, Mark, I'd love to know, could you share with us a little bit about yourself and your background?
So, and Sally, likewise, I'm very excited to be here. It's a great opportunity to talk about a topic I'm very excited about, that I believe in deeply, and I've used over my career on a number of occasions with major clients around the world. My background is 40 odd years in the information technology field, working for major corporations like BHP, Accenture, and working with major corporations like JP Morgan, most of the major Chinese companies when I lived in China for a number of years. And so, you know, deep background, lots of experience, and I've been a proponent of scenario planning for many, many years. Clearly, where we are today highlights the need and the requirement to leverage tools that will help business and community leaders better manage the uncertainties that we're going through. And that's the power of scenario planning.
Yeah, and I understand that you're a very strong proponent of scenario planning, and obviously throughout, you know, the course of your career. But more importantly, right now with everything that's going on with this pandemic, why is that?
Well, I think it's important that we actually deal with uncertainty. We're better off to manage uncertainty than to avoid it. You know, and it is the paradox of uncertainty. The more you resist, the more relevant it becomes. The more you embrace and understand the uncertainty and manage it, the better the outcome will be for you and the organisation and society. You know, think about where we are today when the huge shift to working from home. And it's a great opportunity to actually start using new technologies and new ways of working. But the unintended consequences aren't understood at all. Yeah, I mean, think about the sleepers that could be there. Think about the opportunity that the hackers of this world have received from being able to access unsecured networks, unsecured devices. You know, we could get to a point where we think we're over the worst of this. Yeah. And then in a few years or a few months, we could find a bank loses all its back-end systems because someone's opened a door or a window by working from home during this period of crisis, uncertainty. It's important to plan for adversity, to understand it and to manage it properly. Very simple example, Sally. Think about the retailers in Australia. Only a month ago, online sales were around 10% of their business. Today, they're nearly 100% of their business.
Yeah, wow.
That's a major turnaround for major corporations. And, you know, a lot of organisations in the retail space have been heading down the route of headless commerce, where essentially it's an enabled online capability. Those that have progressed that scenario will be the winners. Yeah. Those that have been, you know, sort of unprepared to take those bold steps as leaders, they'll end up suffering the consequences. And what scenario planning does is it allows you to identify the uncertainties, put them into the context of different scenarios, and then to build strategies to deal with those scenarios if and when they eventuate, and to make sure that your organisation and your people are aligned. Scenario planning, because of the approach you take, involves clearly the leaders in your organisation, but typically a broader base of people. And it's a great vehicle for communication to the people in the organisation around what the leadership's actually doing about tomorrow.
Yeah.
None of us anticipated this. Yeah. And one can understand why. But the reality is we are where we are. We're now a society that's in lockdown, essentially.
Yeah.
We don't want to be here again. But the reality, Sally, is that uncertainty is going to be part of our life forevermore. Yeah. So the disruption of new and emerging technologies. What's the consequence? Think out 50 years, right? And we've got self-driving cars. So there's a person driving an automobile, self-driven, and one of the sensors on a curb fails, and the car mounts the curb and kills someone. Who's liable?
Yeah.
Is it the person in the car? Is it the person that manufactured and delivered the sensor? Is it the engineer that designed the car? Is it the software programmer that programmed the software to pick up the sensor? There's a liability crisis heading our way. And the more intelligent devices become a bigger part of our life, the greater uncertainty we're really going to have to deal with. And that's the paradox of the future we see. And that's why scenario planning is so important. You know, Shell's been using scenario planning since the 70s. And they probably are the best equipped major oil company in the world to predict future trends. They've averted oversupply. When OPEC has driven oil into the market, Shell's had the ability to anticipate that. When they moved into Russia and Russia entered the oil industry, you know, at scale, Shell had a whole series of strategies built around that entry. So
what's your understanding of why Shell have maybe been using scenario planning for such a long time when many companies don't?
Well, I think it's a question of leadership, insight, and ownership of outcomes. Shell has always taken the view that they've got a broader responsibility than just delivering oil to the pump. They've got a responsibility to the community, to their stakeholders, to their consumer. So they take a broad view, and they are very methodical, very well focused, and they understand that if they manage certainty, then they can mitigate uncertainty. And they've done that for a long, long time.
And so how would, say, a company or government go about trying to employ scenario planning, particularly at the moment, which, you know, as you've highlighted, a lot of different companies and even government to an extent, unfortunately, you know, they're not sort of as prepared as maybe they could have been for a scenario like this. So it's really important right now that they're sort of starting to really focus on something like scenario planning. So how would you suggest they can go about employing that?
Well, Sally, I've got a very good and immediate example. So I'm working with a small technology company that's embraced scenario planning as a leadership tool. And they're asking questions about where will their business be in 6 months, 12 months, 2 years. They're involving the whole team. We're sitting down and working through the uncertainties. And it's interesting how the uncertainties that individuals identify butt up against each other. You know, and it's interesting to see what individuals can come up with as a mitigation to a potential scenario. You know, this company has worked with a number of major organizations for a long time, doing very complex systems integration work and deployment. What they've also done is they've built a remote work management tool that allows them to work remotely with agents in any other part of the world, in Europe, Bratislava as an example, in Asia, Singapore and Hong Kong, and now Shanghai. And what they're saying is that they can actually use this methodology they've built to provide work to new clients that have effectively been shut down and have limited access to technologists. If you look at what the Victorian government are doing, there's an incredible surge in resource needs for the Victorian government, who see that technology can be a great enabler of the shift out of this pandemic and crisis we're in. So I think sitting down with teams and working through scenario planning and limiting your horizon. So don't take a 3 to 5 year view in the first blush. Take a 6 months to 12 months to 2 year view, and think about what you can start changing today and what you can leverage to improve and deliver greater certainty in the short to medium term. And this organisation I'm working with have got incredible accolades from their whole team around the leadership being prepared to take these steps now.
Yeah, I think a little earlier you highlighted, for example, if we look at, say, you know, the cybersecurity space and sort of some of the, you know, I suppose vulnerabilities really we're sort of, you know, putting ourselves within at the moment, given everyone sort of really quickly had to start working from home. And, you know, interestingly, I've always sort of heard, you know, commentary around, for example, at least in Australia, that maybe in Australia the culture is we don't take cybersecurity as seriously as we should. But do you have any simple examples of, you know, past examples that you have seen where scenario planning definitely could have been used as a tool to deliver better outcomes than were actually achieved?
Well, I can think of many. Well, you know, and I think, you know, cybersecurity is a very good example of where people have intuitively, you know, sort of implemented cybersecurity. But when an organisation that I work with probably 18 months ago sat down and said, we don't feel that we actually have a handle on our security exposure. So they did sit down and they did work through, a scenario planning solution where they lost all their systems. What that meant was basically they were out of business within 48 hours because they didn't have the ability to keep running the engine. They would have all these goods and services and they had no idea what customers would want that. When the customer would turn up to take delivery of the good or service, they understood very clearly that if they lost their system, it was an end state for them. Similarly to what we're doing with health records. Electronic health records, if the system goes down, then because the online health record actually provides a view of the treatment the patient's been through, then essentially, if you can't back to manual records, you probably can't operate on that patient in the timeframes they need it. So anticipating failure, creating, a good understanding of uncertainty and then managing that. In a number of cases, Sally has worked, and when it hasn't been employed, the unintended consequence has been catastrophic failure for businesses.
So would you say in layman's terms that scenario planning, a large part of it is really just understanding what's the cadence of your backup plans here, and if this, then that, and just being prepared for the bigger picture?
Yeah, and I think also too, having alignment. I mean, historically in major technology programs, the program manager will create issues and a risk log, right? And they typically work that through on a regular cadence with the team. But often, and I've been doing this for a very long time, often, Sally, nothing is ever done with those issues or risks. What scenario planning does, it actually puts a spotlight on that and said, you do need to identify the risks and the issues, the uncertainties, and then you need to plan, and then you have to have the courage to act on those plans and drive innovation where required and eliminate some tasks where required. But importantly, set a beacon for where your organisation wants to be and how it's going to get there, regardless of the uncertainty or the disruption that comes along. And in many cases now, think about all the fintechs that have been the darlings of the stock market. They're in great peril right now. And what's happening is major corporations, such as banks, are actually buying fintechs to reposition their business.
Yeah.
So they're creating a new co on the basis that they will step away from the legacy environment once that new co's up and running. It shouldn't take a crisis like this pandemic to get organisations to start thinking around scenarios like that. But unfortunately it does. And if you procrastinate as a leader, you will ultimately fail, and the failure will become more significant today than it was 5 years ago. We are never going to be able to avoid disruption or uncertainty. It's going to become greater. The cycles of change are going to become shorter. We need to learn from where we are today. We need to leverage the opportunity of what this crisis delivers and then move forward as leaders, putting in place new ways of working, new ways of managing our clients, better ways of managing our business, delivering as much certainty to the community, to the customer, and to the stakeholder and shareholder as we possibly can.
Yeah, I love your mention to leveraging what the crisis can deliver for us. And I think, you've highlighted a really important point that, probably a lot of people can resonate with that. Many organizations, unfortunately, they do procrastinate about innovating or changing the way they do things to prepare for, unfortunate events and so forth. And this is a time where it's really forcing leadership to think about what they're doing and sort of reboot their thinking a little bit and change how they're approaching their management style. So I know you mentioned that Shell, for example, have been using scenario planning as a part of their sort of strategic planning processes for quite some time. Who would you say, when it comes to employing scenario planning in an organization, for example, what have you seen at Shell or even beyond that? Who needs to be engaged in that process or in that exercise within the organization?
Yeah. So, I mean, it's easy to say from the chief executive officer to the middle managers need to be involved. Right? I actually take it a step further. I think what you need to do is need to have that leadership engaged, but you need to be communicating what you're doing with the whole organisation and soliciting input from everyone in the organisation. Because I'll guarantee you, Sally, if I walk onto a shop floor in a manufacturing business, the people closest to the operations can tell me what the greatest uncertainties are. When they think a machine might fail, when they think a supplier might fail, when they think, you know, a workmate might not understand the safety requirements, they're the people that actually understand where the greatest points of exposure are. So you need to solicit input from every level of the organisation. And some of it will be, you know, great, and some of it won't be so great, but you're actually communicating to the organisation that everyone fills an important role. Everyone observes where the business is, the good and the bad and the ugly, and you need to get that in front of the leadership team and identify the uncertainties and build your strategies to move forward if they eventuate. Yeah. So I think it's everyone in the organisation with clear leadership from their CEO and the C-suite team. Think about it, Sally. We took companies that at the end of last financial year had record profitability, and today they're facing bankruptcy. Right? That's the imperative that leaders are going to have to face up to. And it's no good shrugging your shoulder and say, well, it's a pandemic. Yeah. Sure, that is an issue. But if they'd planned, if they'd positioned their business differently, then they would have had the capacity to respond to this in a very different way, instead of looking at their business thinking, we won't be here in 3 months.
And that's a great segue to what I want to ask you next, which is, you know, at the moment with this pandemic, and obviously maybe, you know, in some scenarios, if I'm really blunt about it, subpar leadership and management to date, that sort of makes this situation worse for certain groups. You know, there's a lot of, you know, it's quite a negative vibe, a negative energy going on at the moment. There's a lot of overwhelm, a lot of uncertainty, and a lot of fear, I think, at every level of the organisation. But would you say that there are any positive aspects of what's going on and maybe how this is going to force us to really think about how we employ scenario planning now, so in the near term, but also beyond this pandemic?
Well, you know, I think a very simple example, Sally, is look at the freeways. Look what's happened with people working from home. So the congestion on the freeways has been eliminated. And so the question is, can we take this opportunity and build out a capability for people to work from home more than work within the CBD? Does that mean we can redivert funds that we're going into infrastructure? Instead of building new roads and railway systems, can we build a better communications network so that we actually have a positive impact on our business, we have a positive impact on our community, we have a positive impact on our environment, and importantly, we start building a different legacy for our future generations. I mean, I look at the generations that are coming behind me now, and I worry for their well-being. Yeah. But I think if we can take a positive view, and I'm a half glass full person by nature, take a positive view, think about where we are, we're managing it globally relatively well, right? So how do we step forward? How do we take this uncertainty and then build certainty for our society, for our community, and for future generations? And I think we have, as leaders, we have to take that step.
Yeah, and that's part of leadership, right? It's just trying to ask those hard questions that you sort of really need to confront with. For, I suppose, you know, different organisations out there, or maybe even certain levels of leadership within, you know, government, or anyone in any situation really, what's your advice to someone as to how they can right now, given this pandemic, what are the first steps they can start taking to even seriously consider employing scenario planning as soon as possible?
Right. So I think a couple of points to consider when moving into scenario planning. If your organisation is under complete distress, right, then you do need to consider scenario planning. But I think what you need to do is get a few fundamentals in order first. If your executive leadership team is not completely committed to doing this, then don't engage, right? This is not something that one individual can drag over the line. This is a concerted effort from the whole team to get it done. So what they need to do as leaders is sit down and really have a hard internal conversation How are we choosing to lead this business, this organisation into the future? But think about people like the NDIA that runs the NDIS. How did they take this opportunity and say, how do we make sure that into the future, those members of society that depend on us providing our services to them, we don't break that cycle. We make sure that we can deliver our services to them because they are critical to the well-being of a huge part of our community moving forward. So I think as leaders, you've got to get together, you've got to have a meeting of the minds, you've got to be prepared to make some tough calls, and you've got to be prepared to communicate and communicate and communicate. At this time, Sally, and I think a lot of people have stepped up very well, you cannot but communicate. You know, looking at what our Prime Minister is doing, the premiers of the various states, they are communicating at least every second day. They're sending the same message. And I think they can adjust how the message is sent. I think we do need to have a greater degree of compassion now revealed to the public. I think we need to say, politicians should be saying, we understand this is really tough, but we need, as a community, to behave differently for a period of time while we come through this. That's addressable. But importantly, the community's got the message. Stay home.
Yeah.
Don't gather together. We can shut this thing down. And I think
certainly a time now with this pandemic where, I think is, globally, we talk about being connected, more connected than we've ever been before, thanks to tech and tech developments and so forth. But I think this is really a situation, a scenario, if you like, that's really highlighting to us all that, this is a collective effort and we are connected at the end of the day. We can't deny that in any way. And I think you make a really good point as to how organisations can really think about aligning internally before just trying to deploy some sort of strategy, because without the cooperation and engagement of a team, it's probably going to be quite ineffective.
Well, yeah, and I think moving forward, if you think about the mature Western world, countries like Australia, New Zealand, Great Britain, US, Europe, we're very mature on the healthcare space. But a lot of countries that are joining the global movement, globalization movement, like India, to a degree, China, other countries, the African countries, they're not as advanced down that healthcare model as we are. And in many ways, our prosperity could be our biggest vulnerability. Because we can't really get our head around the fact that there's a health issue in Africa that actually now they're part of the global community could become a problem for people in Australia or, Germany.
Yeah.
I think we need to have a better appreciation of what globalization means in terms of global well-being, not just, is it advantaging Australia? Are we more profitable? Are we, as our GDP increase? We need to understand. But now we've got a different responsibility. We've got a responsibility to make sure that all the communities in this globalization move are actually well cared for and looked after. And I think that's something that leaders globally need to come to terms with. And I do congratulate the work of Scott Morrison highlighting to G20 that, the Pacific Island nations need a different level of support.
Yeah.
I think we have to bring that level of compassion and charity and insight to the table more effectively. And that's responsibility of community leaders, business leaders. It's not something we should walk away from. I think we do need to embrace it if into the future we can better manage situations like we're now. And they are going to occur, Sally.
Yeah.
We've had decades of prosperity and, this is going to become more likely into the future than it has been for the last 50 years.
Yeah. Well, it's certainly a wake-up call for us all. And I think, the concept of scenario planning, which you're obviously well experienced with, is probably a very, effective and productive tool that different groups can use to just contextualize what's going on and ensure that they've sort of, got their hands on the reins as best as they can for themselves, their teams and all their major stakeholders. So is there anything else you wanted to leave everyone with? I really appreciate your time. I know I've certainly learnt a lot and I know this is certainly going to force me to think differently, even at a very micro level, about how I approach different situations to plan for the future and think about what I'm doing to prepare for what may or may not happen.
Well, I think, Sally, the thing I'd like to leave with you is I think we do have to take a very positive view of what can come out of this situation. I think if we become too much of a black hat, then inevitability will occur and things will worsen. I think we've got to take a really positive view and say we're smart, we're well educated, we can build out of this, and we can probably build a better future for everyone.
Yeah.
You know, I'm available. I'm more than happy to work with clients and, you know, spend as much time as I need helping them step through this. And I think I've got a responsibility to really help, you know, the global organisations, local organisations, take a more positive view of the future and help them develop scenario plans so that they can actually be part of the world economy into the future. So I'm here to help.
Part of this. Yeah. Beautiful. Thanks so much for your time, Mark. I appreciate it. And I'll ensure that everyone gets access to, at minimum, your LinkedIn profile. But thank you so much for your time. Take care and happy scenario planning.
Thank you. Thank you, Sally. Cheers.